What's up, guys? Welcome to Metal Vibes, and today we are going to be ranking the albums of the Singapore-based grindcore band Wormrot. So, welcome back, everybody. Sorry for missing last week. We had some technical issues, along with a lot of stuff I had to catch up on in my personal life. But we are back. We got a new phone, which means a new camera, and we're going to be ranking Wormrot, who I would say have released some of my favorite material in the grindcore genre. Although I do admit I don't listen to grindcore a whole lot, but what Wormrot has put out is absolutely incredible in my book. With their most recent album, Hiss, generating quite a lot of buzz, especially on year-end lists, I thought it'd be fun to do a dive into the band's discography and kind of talk about what I think of their albums. For some background, Wormrot formed in 2007, and they would soon solidify their core lineup, which consisted of Ras Yeed on guitar, Arif on vocals, and Fit or Fitri on drums. With this lineup, the band would release their debut album, Abuse, in 2009. Abuse was actually one of the first grindcore albums that I heard, and I actually kind of wish it wasn't, because I think Abuse sort of spoiled the genre for me. Whereas a lot of grindcore, I feel, just kind of blasts along and feels pretty tight and pretty calculated, Abuse really doesn't feel like that at all. To me, this album just feels like a raw outburst of insanity, like a wild stream of consciousness that just veers from one idea to the next and just leaves you clinging on for dear life. The songs just constantly charge forward and move between really cool ideas, from catchy grooves to explosive power chords to vicious chugs. I think you particularly hear that in songs like Born Stupid, which just barrel along with these explosive power chords, and then you just have this shout of go, and then this just devastating groove. Then you have another groove later in the song that just sounds like an oinking pig. Murder is another really cool song, which combines gang shouts and really fast grooves before breaking in some heavier and slower grooves. This album overall is just relentless, with no real pauses between tracks, and I would say adding to the insanity are Arif's vocals, which veer between high shrieks and deep low kind of death growl gurgles. I also love the Englishy song titles like So Fierce for Fuck, which just kind of add to the no fucks given attitude about this album. There also are quite a couple ideas that stand out here, particularly in the song Freedom to Act, which has a groove that literally sounds like it could have been pulled from a Lamb of God song, and I just love every second of it. The song Fuck I'm Drunk stands out with this winding melodic riff that kind of sounds like it could have come from Dismember after drinking too much alcohol on a Saturday night. Sledgehammer's a cool little cut that gets progressively faster and faster as it goes. The only real slower moments on this album are right at the beginning and right at the end, with the opening track Lost Swines beginning with an intro of some guy screaming about the Patriot Act before we get some slower chords that come in, and then a barrage that just begins. I would say at only 22 minutes in length, though, this album really isn't that exhausting, and it didn't really need too many slower moments. This is grindcore, after all. The raw production on this album just fits it perfectly. And I would say overall, you really just rarely hear an album that just sounds this utterly maniacal. Because of that, Abuse is one of my favorite grindcore albums ever. The only one that really comes close in this genre to me is Insect Warfare's World Extermination. You know, interestingly, in interviews, the band talked about how they wanted to play more of a death grind sound, but playing just straight grindcore kind of came more naturally to them. And I'm kind of glad they went with what came more naturally, because it produced what I consider one of my favorite albums in the genre. This is definitely my favorite Wormrot album and one of my favorite grindcore albums of all time. Absolutely insane. Following Abuse, the band would get some attention, including from Earache Records, who would sign the group and put out their second album, Dirge, in 2011. Bit of a production shift on this one. You got a little bit more power to the guitars and maybe a slightly more clear sound overall. Stylistically, however, I would say this record kind of carries forward that same sound from Abuse, maybe with a little bit more blasting and a little bit less grooves and a slightly tighter overall performance, which I think makes the record sound a little less unhinged and organic than Abuse did. Because of that, I don't quite like it as much as Abuse, but I still think there's some great stuff here. One thing that comes to mind right as I start listening to this album is that while Wormrot write short songs, their tracks actually feel like songs. Sometimes grindcore bands kind of just string together 2 or 3 ideas in a short runtime and call that a song. But Wormrot have a sense of finesse about them, and I think you hear that on the opening track here, No One Gives a Shit, which kind of builds tension with these off-kilter notes before you just get this quick explosion, and then the onslaught of the album just begins. Public Display of Infection is probably one of my favorite songs here, and has one of my favorite song titles of all time. The vocals just sound especially demented on this track, and I love the way the guitars just build into this crescendo before Arif just goes, Public Display of Infection! Just drawing out the track title. Principle of Puppet Warfare just has catchy riffs all around and a really spastic feel. And despite the fact that I would say Dirge is a little less groovy overall, there are some pretty cool grooves here. The Final Insult and Backstabber Mission Aborted are both tracks that I would say stand out for the grooves. Butt Krieg is Showing is another standout track to me. It's got some interesting chords in it that would kind of foreshadow what Wormrot would start doing on their 2 later albums. The other thing I'll say about Dirge is I don't think this record overstays its welcome. At only 18 minutes, it kind of just gets in, does what it needs to do, and gets out and doesn't mess around, which I can definitely respect. I think Abuse had a few more enjoyable moments, and it had a little bit more of that raw feel that I kind of liked, but Dirge is also a fantastic album. I'll put it just slightly below Abuse in the track list, but these are pretty close to me, I would say. Dirge is definitely pretty high up there on the list of my favorite grindcore albums, for sure. So there was a pretty big gap following Dirge, and I think at least some of that was attributable to it being pretty difficult for Wormrot to be a band. In interviews, the members would talk about how they would basically just quit their jobs when they would go on tour and then just try to find new jobs when they came back. Nonetheless, I do think the band were pretty successful at steadily building a more higher profile for themselves, and I think they really capitalized on that higher profile with their 3rd album, 2016's Voices. So Wormrot had a new drummer for this album, Vijesh, who joined after Feetry left the band in 2015. The one thing I'll say about Voices is that every time I think about this album, I think about how when it came out at the end of 2016, there was so many high-profile releases coming out around that time as well, with acts like Vader, Dark Tranquillity, Meshuggah, and Anil Nathrak all putting out albums right around that time. But Voices still managed to stand out, and I think part of the reason was because, one, Wormrot were gaining a lot of underground respect at this time, but 2, Voices took a little bit of a different approach, and I think people really noticed it because of that. And what I mean by that is I think on Voices is where Wormrot's experimental edge really started appearing. You have a lot of weirder chords on this album that almost sound like something from post-black metal, like Death Heaven or Downfall of Gaia. The songs Hollow Roots and Exit Fear are 2 early examples of that in the album. Then you have some stranger moments in general, like The First World Syndrome and Shallow Standards, both of which kind of just have this weirder riffing that almost reminds me of Discordance Axis. I think while prior Wormrot albums emphasize the insanity and aggression, this album deviates by packing a more emotional edge at times as well. Gods in His Heaven, for example, is a track that has these fast vocals with these chords that are just filled with desperation. The closing track, Outworn, kind of packs a similar feeling, and I think makes for a really emotional ending to this record. Those weirder and more emotional moments on Voices, I think, feel like a good progression, but I think the biggest thing that prevents me from enjoying Voices more is the drumming. And not that it's bad drumming, because it's not. In fact, I think Vijesh is probably a more accomplished drummer than Feetry is, but I think I just preferred Feetry's more unhinged and wild performances from the first couple albums, which just sounded so spontaneous. That being said, this is still grindcore, and Vijesh still packs plenty of aggression, particularly in songs like Fake Moral Machine, which has these catchy riffs and screams of the track title at the end. Take Aim and Compassion is Dead also offer some groovy riffs, which I really like. Production-wise, the sound here is a lot sharper and more clear than the first 2 albums, which I think really fits the sound. This album feels more like getting stung by 1,000 bees, whereas the first 2 albums kind of felt like getting stabbed with a rusty knife. It's pretty hard to rank Wormrot's albums, and especially Voices, because I appreciate the new influences on this record, but I just don't enjoy it quite as much as the first 2, so I'll actually rank it slightly lower than them, and we'll see how this pans out in terms of the actual numerical rankings. Alright, so following Voices, Wormrot would take a 6-year gap, but come back in 2022 with their 4th and latest album, Hiss. I have to say, despite the fact that it took so long for them to release this album with a 6-year gap, I think they really came back in fine form here. Hiss kind of continues that trajectory from the last album, but gets even more weird and more experimental. But I think it does it in a way that results in more standout ideas. Listening to Hiss, it's almost like they wrote every song with the question in their mind, how can we make this different from every other song on the album? Because of this, you have ideas like the moaning singing in the early highlight, Broken Maze. Then you have violin appearing sporadically throughout the album, like on the track Weeping Willow. You also have tracks like Sea of Disease, which almost don't even sound like grindcore and sound more like noisy post-hardcore songs. But probably the least grindcore influenced stuff here are tracks like Pale Moonlight, which is basically just harsh vocals and tribal drums. You even have some carryover from the last album with the track Desolate Landscapes, which kind of has those same post-black metal chords that you heard on Voices. Hiss is a very eclectic album, and I think right in line with that, this probably features Arif's most diverse vocal performance. He delivers everything from wild shrieks to whispers to desperate shouts. The track Seizures is particularly notable for Arif's vocals, where it just sounds like he's having a total meltdown. I think the closing track Glass Shards is similarly gripping in that regard. I think my biggest criticism of Hiss is that with all this this weirdness, the album just kind of lacks a little bit of cohesion. At times, it almost feels more like a bunch of short experiments sort of combined together, and it just doesn't quite achieve that same smooth flow that you had on Wormrot's prior albums, especially the first two. That said, I will say the material on Hiss is just dripping with so much inspiration and so much emotion. Production-wise, I think this is also fantastic, with an even better production job than Voices had. Obviously, I like the raw sound of the first two albums, but I think considering what Wormrot were doing on Hiss, I don't think a raw production job would have really fit. Hiss is overall a lot more memorable than Voices to me, and while it doesn't have that same manic energy that the first two albums captured, there are still some pretty brutal moments here. Behind Closed Doors, for example, with some thrashy riffs and turn on a dime tempos. Then you have the song Hatred Transcending, which just sounds like a stampede of rhinos. Yeah, overall, I'd say Hiss is a fantastic album, and honestly, if I were to redo my top 10 of 2022 list today, this probably would earn a spot on it. It is tough to rank this. I do think it's better than Voices, but Dirge and Abuse are so close. But I do really love Hiss. I think I'll actually split the difference and put Hiss in the number 2 spot with Dirge right below it, but these top 3 albums are really close, and really all their albums are great. This is really not a best to worst list, but more of a best to not quite as best list. Unfortunately, Arif would leave after Hiss, with the vocal spot in Wormrot still vacant to this day. Presumably they will continue, but it'll be interesting to see what happens from here, because losing a vocalist is usually never easy. But that's my Wormrot ranking. Let me know in the comments what you think of Wormrot. Let me know how you would rank their albums. And as always, if you like this video, please subscribe, please drop me a like, and let me know in the comments what band you would like to see me rank next. And if you want to see me talk about more bands, check out this video over here where I rank the albums of Revocation. But that'll do it for this one, guys. Thanks as always for tuning in, and I'll see you next week. Stay heavy.